Testing, 1, 2, 3. Kristen and Amy, would you like to come up with me, please? I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. It was very short notice, and I know that all of you have things you have to do in your lives, and it's just special to us that you would take the time out of your day, especially a beautiful day like today, to come and listen and talk with us about the things that are going on in Hancock County. This county is very important to all of us. We love living here, we love owning a part of it, and we love the people that are in it, and to be able to kind of try to figure out ways to get through this time together that we're all experiencing the COVID and the different parts of the pandemic means an awful lot. I want to especially thank Kristen Halls and the Hancock County Farm Bureau and Amy Graham and CCDC for helping me to put this together and co-hosting this event. And just appreciative of all the efforts that everybody has made. Bonnie, thank you for all the work you put into this, and a special thanks to the Legacy Board for allowing us to host this event here. Darin, thank you so much. I know a couple months ago we talked on a call and I told you of some of the experiences that we're having here in Hancock and how we need help, just especially some kind of guidance on what we should do. And you promised we would circle back on that topic. It's taken a couple months, but we're here. We're circling back, and I appreciate your effort and your traveling here to do that. And Randy and Jill, as always, I talk to you quite a lot, and you've yet to hang up the phone on me or not answer the phone, and you usually return emails. So I'm especially grateful for all the efforts that you make. I think that what we're undergoing as a result of this pandemic, and the mayors especially, I hope will take a few moments, and everybody else that has some insight into whatever their walk of life may be, can kind of share some of those experiences. But we each have a different walk that we're journeying on the pandemic walk. And I think if we can just come together on the federal and state and local level and talk about that, we can come to some solutions and work together. So that's my hope. So I am going to turn this over to Darin, and then we can kind of go from there. And I think the plan is kind of let each one of them maybe speak a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So I will turn it over to Darin. And thank you to Chris and Horsehead Studios. I was so going to say that, and I forgot. You are phenomenal. And also to the media that's here today and made the journey. Appreciate all you do. Thank you.
Linda, thank you very much, and Kristen and Amy, thanks so much for putting this together, and great to be with my colleagues, Randy Frese and Senator Jill Tracy. And thank all of you for being here also. I look forward to your questions and your comments and the dialogue and discussion. That's part of why we're here today. What I thought I would do is just talk, and I want to welcome the mayors, elected officials, and the other business owners and employers here in Hancock County. Thank you for being here. Just initially, I want to just say a few words and make a few comments, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues, and then we'll open it up. But obviously, I'm honored to represent you in Washington, D.C., and I know it has been a difficult and challenging time for all of us over the last 7 or so months. And it has been, again, disruptive in so many different ways. And, as we continue to grapple with the pandemic and how we adjust, it's important to work in a collaborative way, obviously making sure that we understand the perspective at the local level, the state level, and the federal level, and do everything we can to get through this. I will say at the federal level, as most of you know, in the spring we passed 4 different bills in a bipartisan way. We allocated about $3.6 trillion in response to the pandemic. That's the most money ever spent by the federal government in that short period of time. It really focused on 2 different things: the economic impact and the healthcare crisis we were facing. And so that money got distributed and spent in a lot of different ways. And we can talk about those. I think the most impactful program that we spent money on was the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program. And I think about the small businesses throughout my district, whether you had 1 employee or you had 100 employees, and the impact that that had. It was really a lifeline to our businesses, allowing businesses and companies and entities to keep their employees on the payroll to get through that very, very difficult time. The other thing that I think we did that was smart is we allowed the PPP program to be distributed through your local banks, your community bankers, your lenders. Going back to 2008 in the last stimulus bill, I wasn't in Congress then, but when we did that, we gave all the money to the big banks that was supposed to filter down to the local level. That never really happened. And so this time around, we allowed, again, to go to your local lender or credit union or community banker, and I think that has been helpful. But I think about those entities in my district, whether it's here in Hancock County or the 18 other counties that I'm fortunate to represent, but it's the restaurants, it's the bars, it's the retail shop, it's the Main Street business, it's the manufacturer, it's the doctor's office or a contractor that got that PPP and helped them get through a very, very difficult time. Moving forward now, obviously there is still a response necessary, and I have been supportive in Washington, D.C. of another relief or stimulus package. Let me just talk about that for a second. There are still businesses that are disproportionately affected by COVID. These are ones that fall into a number of different categories. If you're in the travel industry, if you're in the lodging industry, if you're in the hospitality industry, if you have a banquet facility or a catering business, or you're an entity like Legacy here where you need to have people gather, they're still hurting. Family-owned restaurants that aren't tied to a chain or a corporation, I really worry how they're going to make it this next 6 to 9 months unless we're there to help them. If you own a gym or a workout facility, they continue to struggle. And so we have an obligation or responsibility at the federal level to pass another bill, a revised, however you want to categorize, a revised PPP type program that helps those businesses get through the next 6 to 9 months. Because most of them, in my view, are not going to come back until we get a vaccine or a cure or a treatment. And so we have to be there for them. Secondly, I am supportive of more money for our cities and municipalities, particularly the ones that are less than 250,000 in population, which is the majority of my district. The last thing that cities and municipalities you need to be worried about is laying off firefighters and police officers and city workers. COVID-related losses of revenue that happened really from March through June, I think the federal government has an obligation there, and so we need to be there for that. I've introduced a piece of legislation called the Clean Start Act, which says if you're a school, if you're an elementary school or a college or a community college, or you're a business, what our bill does, and I've introduced it with a Democrat from Florida, Stephanie Murphy, but we've said the huge cost of PPE, plexiglass, cleaning supplies, masks, all these things that now businesses have to implement, it costs a lot of money. It costs schools a lot of money. Prior to being here today, I was up at West Prairie School, and I'm speaking to kids up there, but I did a tour of the school. And they told me just how much it costs to implement all of that PPE. And I know that's reflected in any business. But again, our bill gives you a 50% tax credit or a tax incentive to write that off. And again, it helps on the economic side, and it also helps on the healthcare side to protect customers, to protect workers, protect employees, or protect kids. And so I'm optimistic in the next stimulus package we can get that passed to bring some relief when it comes to PPE and that sanitation and sanitizer and hygiene that is necessary. So those are a few things that I think we have a responsibility to work on. I'm not optimistic we're going to get another stimulus or relief package done before the election, but I think right after the election we have an obligation again to do that, and I'm supportive of a revised PPP program to get us through this difficult time. Let me just transition, and I know Jill and Randy can talk about this. I've been very frustrated with our governor in the state of Illinois in the way that he's treated downstate Illinois, and I've spoken out against that. I've done that publicly. At the very beginning of this, I recommended that we go to 3 different tiers in the state of Illinois. Chicago ought to have been Tier 1, suburbs Tier 2, and downstate Tier 3. 75% of the state of Illinois is farmland, and we ought to be treated accordingly. If you look at the cases in Illinois, 92% of them are in northern Illinois. You know, we've been lucky in downstate. We exercise a lot of social distancing, but the one-size-fits-all for communities like Carthage or Hamilton or Dallas City or Nauvoo, it's ridiculous that we're treated the same as Chicago. And I worry about those small businesses and the livelihood and the ability to thrive and prosper with small business owners and how they're affected by that. And so I think it's a real mistake. I've been critical of the governor on that, and I wish he would reverse some of these regulations. I use the example all the time of if you live in Quincy and you can drive across to Hannibal, it's under a totally different system. And so, again, we're going to continue to push that the governor make those decisions. When I was at the school before this, another thing, we're the only state in the Midwest that doesn't have sports for our high school kids. We're the only one that can't play high school football. Again, to me, downstate Illinois, we've been blessed. We haven't had the cases or the infections or those type of things. And so relieving the burden on some of those regulations, I think, has to be a part of what we do at the state level. And so I'm going to continue to advocate for that moving forward. Lastly, I would just say, my district is one of the largest ag districts in the country. It's the 8th largest in the country in terms of corn and soybean production. And we got to be there for our farmers. In Illinois, ag is the #1 industry. I remind my friends from Chicago about that often. But supporting our farmers, supporting agribusiness, whether it's trade deals, we passed the USMCA with Mexico and Canada. We got a phase 1 deal with China that they're on the hook to buy a lot of corn and soybeans. We got to continue to look for opportunities for our farmers to let them prosper and thrive and do well in our ag community. So anyway, those are a few of my thoughts. I look forward to your questions and your comments and the dialogue and discussion we're going to have. So with that, I will turn it over to Senator Tracy and then look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate Congressman LaHood's comments. I really don't have much to tell you. We haven't been in session in Springfield since March, I believe it was, and we have asked to be back, and as Congressman LaHood mentioned, there's been many things that we have not agreed with the governor on, and certainly it's clear that all of the state was kind of put into one basket, and it's been very trying. I know we were trying to get the Nauvoo Grape Festival back online, and no reason we couldn't have done that safely with social distancing and proper practice, but we were turned away and really not given much of an ear of listening to at all. So, but we'll still try to do these things, and I've heard from you over the course of these few months while we've been in this pandemic, and we've tried to work through issues, and we will continue to work through those issues. But most of all, I appreciate hearing what your issues are. And with that, I'll turn it over to Representative Frese, who I love working with, and because we want to hear from you.
Let me get rid of this for a minute. Thank you very much, Jill. So likewise, enjoy working with you as well. I think it's a great team. We terminated in early March our session in Springfield and thought we would be back after a week off. And it turned out we weren't back until the end of May. And when we came back in May, what we were able to discuss was narrowed to 3 fields. And that was whether if it was involving the budget, or if it was involving the emergency COVID issues, or if there were certain termination dates that were going to be coming up that needed to be addressed before those dates came. So we were very much handcuffed, and we continue to be handcuffed by the governor and by the speaker. We should be back as a legislature providing some leadership on which way we want to see the state go. And we're happy to have the governor at least listen to part of our plan and expand the number of zones in Illinois. When he came out and we were restricted, I think our particular zone that we're in here went all the way from the Mississippi River all the way across to the Indiana border. And we thought that was perhaps a little bit largesse. So he did narrow us down a little bit, and luckily we've been able to stay within the numbers, but we're not moving fast enough in my estimation. Just as an anecdotal little story, my wife and I got in a car and took a little trip on this past Sunday. We were in Hannibal, Missouri, and I've been told, but I had to find out for myself, we found a little soccer field where kids were playing, And we drove down two sides of the parking area, and I counted 13 of 23 vehicles were Illinois plates. So we know people are migrating. They're going to there for the entertainment, and while they're there, we know they're buying gasoline. We know they're going to the restaurants. We're perhaps shopping other stores. And so we're losing that business, and we need to make sure that our economic house is in order here in Illinois. So I can't wait to get back, and we're supposed to be called back after the election for a veto session. I look forward to that. We need to be providing some leadership. Just recently, you may have heard or read, the state of Michigan, the courts had ruled in favor of the legislation against the governor there, who expanded her emergency orders, executive orders past the 28 days. That should be similar in the state of Illinois. I'm not sure if we had any update on any of those court cases, on how that's going. I've not read anything lately. Calls to my office, a lot about the ethics, and the ethics panel that's meeting currently and investigating Mike Madigan, the speaker, and the ComEd situation. That continues to be ongoing, and for what the state is doing, for what the legislators are doing and investigating is one thing, but I think the real power is in the federal investigation of this, and it will be ongoing, and that's probably where we should be maybe focusing more of our attention. IES, Illinois Employment Security, has been kind of a nightmare. It's been a source of a lot of phone calls to our office, whether they're people that are laid off, furloughed, or simply they're out of jobs because their place of employment stopped doing business. And I know they were inundated, but we never did catch up. And now we're starting to get the calls, and I'm sure Senator Tracy can echo this, starting to get calls now that people who did receive benefits are now saying, well, we gave these benefits in error, we're now denying, we want you to pay it back. So now we're having to deal with some of those issues as well. So that continues to go on. Graduated income tax, going to be on the ballot this year. Maybe some of you have already voted. It is a ballot initiative. I don't endorse either side. All I say is get educated on the subject. And if you're in agriculture, you're a farmer, the Hancock County Farm Bureau is a good source of information on that. Or if you're a business owner, perhaps your economic development or your Chamber of Commerce would be a good place. So if people ask you, send them to those folks, and they have information. They'll be happy to educate people on the ballot. We shouldn't just look over it and not vote. We should all take a stance on where that's taking us. So I know I could go on, but I'm sure you've got questions. So I'll hand this back to Congressman, and I guess we open it up for questions now. Is that the next step, Belinda? Okay, thank you.
And I forgot to tell you, I'm so glad we're not on a Zoom call today. So thank you for being in person. Yes, so we're happy to be in person, so thank you.
So if everybody is okay with it, I will let the mayors go first, so they can ask their questions and kind of bring up their topics, and then everybody else can kind of segue in after that. If that's okay, we'll start with Mayor McCarty. You ask whatever you like, sir.
Actually, it's really hard to address like certain questions to you where what you deal with on a day-to-day compared to your range of our local issues.
thanks for your question, and you're exactly right in terms of how that affects a small community like Nauvoo and many others by losing that population. The answer is the request has been made to the U.S. Census Commission on how they're going to deal with circumstances like you just talked about that are unique to COVID. A determination has not been made yet, but there are multiple requests that have been made for exigent circumstances like you described it. Let me ask you, has the city actually applied, or have they talked to the Census Bureau about that? Do you know, Mayor?
Yes, and we were told we could try to reach the missionaries that we're going to be living in Nauvoo during this summer and give them the information where they could have the option to pick one or the other. You can pick living elsewhere or your residence there. The only trouble is you can't follow back up and find out if they did that or not.
Yeah.
We have no idea how many homes were missed because of privacy. They won't let that out. So we don't know what homes were found.
Well, I mean, what you just described there seems pretty common sense to me. Now, the federal government doesn't operate on common sense a lot of times, but I would tell you, I'll make sure that we follow up directly with the census on this. And if you have a copy of a letter, or we're happy to generate a letter of our own to them to follow up on this, on what are the procedures, and Brad Stotler from my office is here, Mayor, and I'll make sure we follow up with you directly on it. Because we've interacted with them a lot on a lot of different issues. And I mean, this one seems pretty reasonable and something that hopefully we can get them to look at and make the right decision on. Sure.
And this might tie into as well, but the others are more on state funding opportunities. I think, of course, all of our communities took a hit this year, but I think the biggest hit's going to be next year. We've already predetermined what kind of money we were going to get throughout this year. So next year, with all the shortages, I'm sure it's going to take a bigger hit. One of the things I've sent a thing way back when it started, of course I sent it to the governor's office, which I
just comment on a couple of the federal areas of jurisdiction there, and then I'll let Jill and Randy talk about a number of the other issues you mentioned. Couple things. I mean, you can imagine the PPP program, which is, of course, federal, affects all 50 states. It's contingent on what's happening in the individual states and how the governor's doing things, and you heard what I had to say about the governor. But obviously, the core of the PPP program was for businesses to keep their employees on the payroll for that 8 to 10 to 12 to 14 weeks so that they didn't go on unemployment insurance. And for the vast majority of small businesses, that worked. They were able to get through the time and then hire them back and get them back on. It didn't work perfect. There's definitely some hurdles and some problems with that. But that's general. I will say this. Hopefully we learn a little something. When I talk about the next round of PPP and how we do that differently, I think many of these things you're talking about, again, you know, there's not, you have kind of a one-size-fits-all for the country, but I think we're gonna hopefully when we revise this second round, we do things a little differently and make sure that that businesses are getting the proper amount of money and it's for longer term because, you know, through the winter a lot of our restaurants aren't going to make it and a lot of these industries aren't going to make it until we do that. So I think you'll see a little different approach in terms of how we do that. The other point that you made on the loss of revenue. Listen, one frustration I've had, we gave the state of Illinois in the spring about $7 billion went to Pritzker. And the thought was that will filter down to the local level. Well, that clearly has not happened, and that's been a frustration. One thing we're looking at in the next round, I mentioned, I'm supportive of more federal dollars to cities and municipalities for revenue loss because of COVID. And what you just talked about there is revenue you would have had that would have paid for city services and things that you would have done, but because of COVID, you didn't have people in your hotels and paying that tax money that was brought into you. There's another thought that instead of giving the money to the governors, we're going to give it to cities and municipalities less than $250,000 and give it directly to you instead of going through the state, right? Now we have to figure out a formula for that and how it works and how you justify revenue-related loss because of COVID. But I think from the frustrations I've heard, I think that's maybe a better approach in terms of giving it to the governor and thinking it's going to filter down. Thanks. I'll let Jill or Randy talk on those other issues.
Thank you. If I wrote them down correctly, first question, motor fuel tax, can it be adjusted? Can it be done? Well, the answer is obviously yes, it can be done, but, will it, is there enough votes that would approve to get it done? I would look there for leadership from IML, the Municipal League, and I would also look for leadership from Toya Township officials who may be on the same page on this, that want to go to work. Those organizations are very well respected. They reach out to us. They can get the coalition of folks together. And if something like that needs to be changed, that communication can be done. And I think they could play a very integral part in that. Prevailing wage, I hear you. We discuss it, but do nothing about it. I do serve on the Labor and Commerce Committee. I personally say labor and lack of commerce, because we still lag behind other states in the Midwest here in Illinois, and we should not. Prevailing wage is one of the reasons why we do. I wish I had an answer for you. It stifles so many things. It needs to be addressed. The DCO grants, it sounds like a communications issue there that we need to get on top of. I'm not sure. We have liaisons within DCO that we could reach out to try to get an answer on some of these things. I'm not sure the number that you're given, how they route you through that, but Jill's office and my office would be happy to call liaisons and find out specific ones that were the grants that were applied for. Again, I go back on one thing I guess I wanted to point out that on the prevailing wage, that Labor and Commerce, there's 30 members of that committee, and 19 are of the Democrat Party, 11 Republicans. There's a lot of things that get brought up, but there's only a few things that actually get taken to a vote. Prevailing wages happens to be one of those. It's one of those protected things. I mean, very obviously, the unions are very much in favor of the prevailing wage, and they protect it because of that. Do you have some things?
Well, I would fill in, likewise what Randy's saying on the prevailing wage. I sit on the Senate side of the Labor Lack of Commerce Committee. We have been trying to ask for a ceiling for small townships, small municipalities, that, you know, if it's a job and there's so much, can we avoid the prevailing wage? And that's never been given. There is a glimmer of hope that because this pandemic has been so severe and so many have found so many struggles, that we can revisit it. And it's doubtful, to be honest, but you never know until you keep pounding away at it, which we will do. One thing that was a glimmer of hope to me, but it didn't happen, was when we were on our working groups during the pandemic and all these Zoom calls and addressing ways to help businesses, we talked about rolling back the minimum wage increases, the one that hit in July, saying, hey, you know, downstate, it is really hurting on the small businesses, and this is really going to be another problem to their business. And it looked like we had a lot of support for that on both sides of the aisle, but in the end, the person that Senator Lightfoot, who is a leader in the Senate, it was her bill, and she said, no, I've worked too hard for too long, and I refuse. And so her colleagues went along with her. However, I mean, you know, as more this continues, it's interesting how many businesses have been in contact with their legislators that normally, say in the city of Chicago, they never heard from their businesses. They were thriving, and they didn't hear from them. And so now they know a new side of the struggles that every business faces, whether it's large or small, but certainly if it's small. I mean, as we point out, a large business usually started out as a small business. And so there's hope there that this is a learning curve for our colleagues, that we can change things. DCO, certainly we'll get a hold of them. They've been less and less being able to get through to them for us as well. Certainly with IDS, unemployment, we've been cut off there saying that, you know, don't bother us, we're working on it. Well, they've had too long to work on their issues, but we still continue to contact them and tell our side of the story of what we're seeing on the employees that haven't heard and cannot get through on a phone line and have been without unemployment since March when this pandemic began, and they're homeless and have no food, and we continue to contact them because that side has to be told, and that's our job to tell it. I think that's everything I put down here, but we will continue to work on those. I mean, that's what we do every day, and it's a struggle, and we hear it.
Come in and said,
for your comments on that. Just as a follow-up, and I know we went over a number of these things, but when I mentioned earlier that the state of Illinois got approximately $7 billion that went to the governor and was supposed to filter down, and you expressed the frustration that hasn't happened. I mean, one of the things we had to deal with initially in the Congress was, you know, do you give the money to the governors, or do you figure out a way to get it to the states, to the municipalities and cities? And we went back and forth, and there's some, I mean, if you talk to some of my colleagues from Texas, they'll tell you the governor got it and distributed it to a lot of the cities and municipalities the way it should have been done. And I don't want to get into blue states or red states or Republican governors, but there's clearly a different reaction and a different response in other states on where that money has filtered down appropriately to the municipalities and cities. That clearly hasn't happened here yet. And again, we're all frustrated with that. As we look at, again, a second round, like I mentioned, I think there is a recognition that we ought to look at doing things differently and bypassing the state and going directly to cities less than 250,000 and figure out the formula on what your revenue loss is and give it directly to you. I'll let Randy or Jill comment on those other questions related to the state if there's any comments on it.
Well, I did want to mention that some of the smaller municipalities, say in Virginia, Illinois, and Beardstown, and Quincy, and I think Havana, we did hear where their grants have been approved. So I think the application process was maybe filed prior to June. So I'm hopeful that even though you aren't hearing much out of them right now, that you might yet hear in the next month or so. And of course, we will contact them and ask them to try to get you more information, because that's just not right when nobody's answering the phone or returning emails. So that's one thing we'll continue to work on. So Randy, anything else?
Kevin,
Other questions?
anything from Dallas City?
I don't know, one thing I got kind of touched just a little bit of what Jim said, the gas part of what's going on. We go to Burlington at least once a week, get our gas over there, unless you're filling up the lawnmower, you know. The one thing kind of gets me, say, LaHood, for instance, their gas is $2.24 a gallon. Okay, in Dallas City, it's $2.44 a gallon. Because we have two gas stations, and one of them is Ramrod, the other one would be that high. What I don't understand is, if a Casey's in LaHood could sell for $2.24, why can't that Casey's in Dallas, 16 miles away, sell for the same amount? Is it price gouging? I mean, that's really all I have. I'm just kind of curious how they can charge 20 to 30 cents a gallon more when it's coming from the same station.
I don't know, you got a response on that, Randy?
I'm not sure I really do have a response other than, I don't run their businesses. I don't set their prices. Their prices for petroleum, the way I understand it, is set at about 5 p.m. every day by the petroleum board or whatever. They get those calls. Everybody's buying, I believe, at that price, but transportation costs are going to be different. Maybe the price of the real estate that you're sitting on may cost you. Maybe somebody's got more of a liability burden that they need to take care of, therefore they need price it accordingly. Maybe their overhead is just maybe higher. I can't speak for those businesses. I can just perhaps see a number of different ways why one place would be a little higher than the other. However, whether it's 224 or 244, we're still, whatever that battle is, we're losing the war by, and we always have. Looking back into the flood years of 1993, when the bridges were closed, people couldn't get across, and we had some of the greatest retail sales numbers at local gas stations at that time ever. So this has been going on for decades and decades, and people have been going across for that. We've just escalated it here recently. So, any thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say that there are times when the Illinois Attorney General's office will field complaints about if it is actually price gouging. When you see spikes, when there's, say, a hurricane or something and everybody thinks the price of cruise is gonna go up. One thing that has been told to me now, like Randy, I can be sure because I don't operate in those businesses, but say Springfield prices may be lower than Quincy prices. What's told to me is when you buy that allotment of gas and what goes into that ground at that location may be purchased at a price, and because the usage isn't as high, say in Springfield, Illinois, a gas station that's on the interstate, that they base their price on what it was when they bought it. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was one thing that was told to me that kind of might make some sense. But anyway, I just throw that out there.
Thanks, Mayor. I wanted to mention a couple of things while I was thinking about it. Obviously, where we're at with a vaccine and a cure and a treatment is on everybody's mind. And obviously, we all know that COVID will pass. I would just say at the federal level, there's been a tremendous amount of money invested in getting a cure or a vaccine or a treatment. And we will get that, and hopefully sooner rather than later. But the CDC, the Surgeon General, the HHS, I mean, they were working with the private sector to get that done. And I'm optimistic that we'll have something here in the next month to 2 months, and then it'll just be ramping that up and getting that going. I mean, so I feel confident where we're at on that, but obviously production, distribution, getting to our vulnerable populations first, they're going to be a big part of that. But obviously the federal government's going to play a role, and we got to make sure we do that as efficiently and as effectively as possible moving forward. But I feel good about where we're at with that moving forward. Second thing that I want to mention, and I know we have some healthcare folks here, you know, back when COVID hit and we passed these pieces of legislation, we incentivized and broke down a lot of the regulations for telehealth and telemedicine. And overall, in a district like mine, that was very positive. So people don't have to, if they needed to drive to a specialist in Peoria or Springfield or Quincy, they could do it at home through telehealth and telemedicine. So we allowed that to happen through CMS with reimbursement and other things. That's been a real positive. Now, what I always say, that has to coincide with a good rural broadband. And your visit to the doctor is only going to be as good as the technology you have in the broadband. And so when we have these conversations about telehealth and telemedicine at the federal level, it's great, but you got to invest in broadband. And in a district like ours that Randy and Jill and I represent, there's a lot of places where you don't have that connectivity, and it's the digital divide. So it's one area that I am very hopeful on, because what we found now in the education realm is when kids went out of school in March and they went to e-learning, there's a lot of places in our urban cities where kids that are still at home aren't learning the way they can because they don't have good connectivity. And so now you have many of my Democrat colleagues that are in line with Republican colleagues. So we have collaboration on broadband and the importance of that. So whether it's in telehealth and telemedicine, which can be extremely impactful for a rural district like ours, or it's in the education realm, that investment and putting money towards that, we found some agreement on that, and I think that'll be good long-term in both of those areas. I wanted to mention that. Other questions or comments?
First off, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Without stroking to this study, you know what I'm kind of driver. Now, one of our biggest problems, you know, you pass a stimulus bill, you give us chances to, you know, participate in programs. We're low staff, and there's a lot of work involved in
Thanks, Mayor, for your comments. And I mean, what you just described there has been replicated over many parts of my district as I talk to people, and particularly in the rural parts, about the level of bureaucracy, the hurdles that you have to go through in order to meet the demands of the Cures Act or a number of these other federal provisions. And so, message received, and I think, again, as we look at this next round of stimulus or relief or how we do that, we've almost looked at, how do you kind of do it in a tiered approach if you're a municipality less than 25,000 that you don't have that burden. As you might imagine, I have no doubt all the mayors here play by the rules and do anything, but there are some municipalities that don't, and some cities that don't follow the rules. And so the oversight of the federal dollars is what you're trying to ensure to make sure people aren't spending it inappropriately or illegally or skimming off the top. And it's unfortunate that in our country we have to go through all that, but those requirements are usually in place because somebody ripped somebody off, and now you got to do that. But my point is, for smaller municipalities, and I don't know what the threshold is on how we do that maybe that burden is a lot less, because the example you gave on the fire department is a good one, and I hear it. And some people don't even want to go through that process because they don't have the time and the energy and the manpower to do it. And so you prohibit the people that you actually want to help. So I get it. It's trying to figure out that right balance to make sure that people aren't taking advantage of the system and doing that, but making sure people need the money and get it. Thanks.
We can open this up for questions now, or just comments on whatever field you happen to be in, and the effect that you've seen through the past few months that it's had on your particular industry or field or community. Chris, would you like to speak just a little?
Yeah, I just have a question. It's not really COVID related, but the China task force report, and I know you played a large part in that. I just some insight.
Sure. Kristen had a question about China task force. Back in May, I was assigned in the House to a China task force, myself and 14 other members of Congress, to look at how do we hold China accountable, how do we look at the threats that China poses on the economic side, the national security side, on the technology side. And so over the last 5 months, we met and we released our report on Thursday of last week in Washington, D.C. And I'll just talk about a couple of the areas that I was involved with, Kristen. First of all, I think there was an acknowledgement on a bipartisan, nonpartisan basis that we have to come up with a plan to counteract China, again, on the national security front and on the economic front. One thing that I focused on, and we did as members, is during COVID, we found out that we were too reliant on China, almost 100% for PPE, for generic drugs, pharmaceuticals, and reagents that go into the testing, that we didn't have any of that production here in the United States. And so everything we relied on China. So we talked about that. Well, that was a mistake. So how do we change that? So in our report, we have 400 recommendations. But we highlight, how do we bring back those supply chains to the United States? Because we don't ever want to be in that position again. And so we have a number of proposals, legislatively, we've laid out for tax credits, tax incentives, to bring those industries back to the United States, so we're never in that position again. We've also looked at decoupling and Buy America provisions that we think will be very, very helpful to leveling that playing field. So that was a big part of what we did. We also looked at how do we use, where we can, tariffs in a targeted way, maybe sanctions in a targeted way, to go after China where they rip us off on the technology front. 5G. We lead the world in technology, America does, whether it's Microsoft or Apple or Google or Amazon or all the big companies. We lead the world. But China is right there. They want to beat us. So in the report, we talk about how do we protect the United States, our IP, how do we get with other like-minded countries to go after China on that. So these proposals and recommendations we have, most of them are very bipartisan. Like I said, 65% of our 400 recommendations have bipartisan support on it. And really what we wanted to do is lay out a roadmap, not for the next 3 or 4 months, but for the next 10 years, on what we should be doing as a country to get us back on track with China. Now, with China, as some of my folks in farming or agriculture will know, I mean, China is an important market. So China is complicated, it's nuanced. Some in our country want to go to a Cold War mentality with China. I don't necessarily espouse that opinion, because we are integrally tied to China economically. They have a middle class of 500 million, right? They buy a lot of corn and soybeans. You know, for the last 5 years, Illinois has led the nation in soybean production. 25% of the soybeans grown in my district go to China almost every year. So that is a huge market. And so it's finding the balance with China on how you hold them accountable, how you keep them in check, but you still deal with them where you can economically. Remember, we have a phase 1 trade deal that the president negotiated, went into effect in February this year. By the end of this year, China's on the hook to buy $60 billion in agriculture products. Again, that's a lot of corn and soybeans and pork bellies and other things. And so what we've tried to do in this report is highlight the deficiencies, highlight the vulnerabilities, lay out provisions on how we do that. On the economic side, make sure that China is abiding by what they've agreed to. In the past, they've reneged on a lot of things. I'll make one other example. In 2001, we brought China into the World Trade Organization, and that was controversial at the time. And the argument was, bring China into the World Trade Organization, and they will westernize, they'll become more modernized, they'll abide by the same rules and standards of other industrialized countries in the world. Well, some of that has happened, but a lot hasn't. We've had 19 cases against the Chinese in agriculture in the World Trade Organization. We've won 18 of them. We're about ready to win another one. My point is, in the past, they've cheated, they've lied, they've been fraudulent in terms of owning up to these things. So I'm going to give President Trump a lot of credit for the tariffs he implemented in China. Again, I'm not generally a fan of tariffs, but that got the Chinese to come to the table because they don't like tariffs. And so that's how we got the phase 1 deal done. We have a lot of recommendations on how you reform the World Trade Organization. China is treated as a developing nation still. That has to change. And when you win one of these cases in the World Trade Organization, it may take you 4 years to win it. By that time, you've already changed and adapted to what the Chinese are doing. So I'm proud of the report that we issued. It is substantive, it is merit-based, it is bipartisan, and it puts us on a path to being competitive against China economically and holding them accountable moving forward. And so that's probably more than you wanted to know, Kristen, but happy. And by the way, it's online. Anybody can look at it. We've released it, and it's a very, very comprehensive report. So if you can't sleep at night, maybe you want to look at it.
Darin, so just to kind of segue into that as well, we spoke a few minutes ago about methane, leaving Carthage and going to Mexico. Well, they lost 1,000 how many jobs a few years back?
Well, at their peak, they were about 1,500 here in Golden.
Okay.
They were the largest employer in Western Illinois.
And they closed and went to Mexico. So we just now, they're finally closing out the rest of the plant, and the last 50 or so are moving to Mexico. What's being done about that?
Yeah. So when I talked earlier about the supply chains bringing them back, again, we have a responsibility if we want to compete in these areas. And I mentioned 3 of them, but there's many others, right? Semiconductors that are all going to the Asia-Pacific market into China. So we as a country have to figure out how do we incentivize that manufacturing barrier, because what China does with their state-owned enterprises, they subsidize a lot of these industries to come over to China. And they do that in Mexico too. So what our proposals look at as from a broader trade proposal perspective is how do we use our tax code to make it lucrative and make it profitable for companies to stay in the United States. And I think when you see our provisions, I think you'll see in those 3 specific areas of PPE, generic drugs, and pharmaceuticals, if we implement those, you'll see those industries coming back to the United States. But that's kind of a template or a roadmap for how we should do it in other industries.
Okay, and then as a border county, we're here, and I have another company over in Hamilton, employs about 100 people, well-paying jobs. Well, they have another factory over in Iowa, and I was just talking to the gentleman yesterday, and he said, they're nice to me in Iowa, I'm not dealing with any of this stuff. You know, maybe I'll just take it all over there. I mean, how am I, or my mayors, or anybody else supposed to
Well, I'm going to be a little bit more blunt than Randy was. If we pass the progressive income tax, those companies are going to want to go to Iowa. And I've spoken out public. I don't think it's a good idea for our state of Illinois to be passing the progressive income tax, and we're going to continue to drive. We've already lost and hemorrhaged so many people and jobs and opportunities out of the state. And again, listen, I was born and raised in Illinois. I'm raising my 3 kids in Illinois. We have wonderful things in this state, and there's plenty of places to have good quality workforce. But it's things like the progressive income tax that are just another check that people say, I'm going to go someplace else.
You're exactly correct. So
Questions, comments for Jill or Randy or myself? Yeah.
You spoke about the federal government giving the states a certain amount of monies. Is there any accountability that the federal government requires from those states, how they spend the money?
There is, yes, there is. So in the Cures Act, first of all, we give a window for how they spend that money and how they do it. And again, in retrospect, but you have 50 different states that treat their state differently, right? So Governor of Texas is going to treat his state different than the government, but it's the same rules for every state. So it's for, obviously, COVID-related expenses, right? And I don't want to minimize it too much, but it's pretty broad in terms of what the money goes to. But that's an interpretation that Governor Pritzker has that's different than the interpretation of the governor of Texas or the governor of Florida or the governor of Georgia or the governor of New York. I mean, everyone treats it differently. And unfortunately, in our state, that oversight and accountability, again, there's a couple lawsuits that have been filed on that. I'm not sure they'll go anywhere. But they also have a window to spend this, right, over the next couple years here to do that. So that's the short answer on it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a comment, a couple of questions for you. One, regarding the $7 billion that you gave to the state of Illinois, and some governors dispersed it the way it should have, and Illinois hasn't. But obviously, those governors in those other states that did appropriately did not have two horse farms that they had to travel back and forth to take care of. So they were working farm operations. So that's where that $7 billion went to. So, but regarding serious questions, one is on PPP, and I'm a banker, and so we did a pretty fair amount of those loans given the size of our bank. The application for these small businesses to qualify for that was a very simple application. Take them 30 minutes, 45 minutes to do it. The request to get forgiveness of money is just arduous work for these small businesses who are trying to get back on their feet. It's been talked about for a long time now. $150,000 or less is going to be automatically forgiven. And it keeps being tied to this additional stimulus package and additional PPP funding. Is there any way those can be separated and can get that $150,000 limit put in place and let these businesses move on and quit having this hang over their head trying to do it?
Well, thanks for the question. I could have mentioned this at the very beginning. This is another issue that I constantly hear throughout my district. So to answer specifically on your question, we believe in Congress, the SBA has the ability to do this on their own, arbitrarily, or the Treasury Department. They have not done that yet. There is broad agreement in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, that any loan under $150,000 should be forgiven. And if we want to have kind of a spot check on that, that's fine, we can do that. But there's clear agreement on that. SBA is trying to say, well, you have to do that legislatively. We don't think that's the case, but so that's more internal. Whenever we pass the next stimulus or relief, that language will be in there to clarify that and be done. But the problem is, as you articulated, a lot of these businesses can't wait much longer, right? They've been waiting and waiting and waiting for the forgiveness, and either they're sitting on money or they don't want to be, to go ahead and make decisions or do things and have it come back to haunt them, right? So I get it. It's clearly a deficiency that we have not solved yet, and we haven't given appropriate guidance on it, and I get it, and we have to work on it.
My second question is there any help for local school districts? Do they have to do teaching in-house and have to do remote teaching as well, remote classes for the families that don't want to send their kids and just having half days of school? These teachers are now being subject to basically teaching twice as much. They have to prepare for what they're going to have in class, and they're going to have to prepare for doing videos that get broadcasted out and lesson plans for that. I am married to a teacher, and fortunately our kids are growing out of the house. And so her nights and her weekends to be able to work on extra stuff for school and making videos and getting that out is not near as burdensome for us as it is for a lot of the younger teachers who have small kids at home, that they need to be helping those kids with their own homework. Instead, they're being asked to do double duty on their teaching requirements. Is there anything the state or the federal government can do as far as getting money into these schools to allow them to have the funds available to hire additional help to do this remote learning and give them some relief? Because we already have a shortage of teachers, and I think all this is going to do is ruin a lot of the young teachers and driving out the education system.
I mean, I couldn't agree more with your comments there. As I just mentioned, I was just at West Prairie School and was in a couple classrooms and talking to teachers. teachers, and my wife and I have 3 teenage boys that are 18, 16, and 14, and thank God they have the teachers they do, and thanks for your wife and what they do. Yeah, they're on the front lines and dealing with this. I mean, we did, okay, a couple things. Figuring out how we can help schools the best with added resources. I mentioned on the cleaning part of that, on adapting to the PPE and the plexiglass and all the things there. There is I think, a bipartisan agreement on more money and more funding for that to help the school districts on that. In terms of more money to hire staff and do those things, you know, I'm not sure when you look at the priorities of the other things that I mentioned, that there's broad agreement on that, on where we spend that money. There's clearly a need on how you do that. And I would also say, again, Illinois, you know, there are a lot of other states that are, you know, in person, and they're not doing the hybrid. So it's depending on where you're at in the country, it's a bit different. So there's not as much broad agreement on that last point on that. I don't know, Jill or Randy, have any thoughts on the education thing? Obviously, and as you know, with education funding, you know, about 80% is state, 20% is federal. But this is obviously a place where the federal government can come in and help. And the Clean Start Act, which is the bill I mentioned, schools would be able to apply for that, so they would be able to get a little break on that. But listen, if this, for some reason, this thing continues and costs add up, you know, we're going to have to do something. Thanks. Jill, you want to talk about that?
No, I was just going to mention, one of the frustrations with the $7 billion that the federal government has given the state, we are one of the slowest states to spend the money. So that has been a huge frustration, and we have certainly called upon our governor to move more of it out to where it needs to be, and certainly where you're talking about would be a very good place to do so.
Now, isn't the majority of that funding coming through the CEO, though? Or getting funded?
Some is, most is, but they're overseeing things that they haven't normally overseen, and they're not used to overseeing that, no. But there are other agencies, can't think of one right off the top of my head, but we were dealing with one where, the Housing Authority is overseeing, and that's IDHS. So, or DHS is overseeing it, so different ones.
I'll just tell you a couple things I jotted down. Illinois doesn't have rainy day funds. I think somebody made a joke one time, we've got $12 million in our rainy day fund, which means we already spent it by the time I started this sentence, telling you how much we had. We have about a $6 billion backlog of debt. I think it's updated regularly on the comptroller's website. I haven't looked at it in the last couple of weeks, but it's still pretty large. The governor does have some discretion, I believe, on how some funds are spent or where he can get additional funds from in order to spend. I've not heard any discussion on whether or not education is currently in that discussion. So, that's all I got. Any more questions?
On a national level, for employment, sorry, Congressman.
Yeah.
With the COVID shutdown borders, it affects our labor pool. Labor, you go around many places throughout our county and western Illinois, a lot of people are looking for workers. There's help wanted signs all over the place. So part of our industry in the ag sector depends on TN visa workers. And consulates closed and not getting stuff legal way to get labor sourcing into the area. That's disrupted a little bit of the continuity of some of the stuff we do. So where is the plan to help get back to that normal flow or on the international basis just with Mexico or that interaction?
Well, I don't think there's a clear answer on that. Let me mention 2 points on that. Obviously with COVID, depending on what country you're from or you live in, on the restrictions and the quarantines and whether you come here or not, I mean, nothing's been resolved on that just because there's a lot of reciprocal, but still most of the borders are shut down, right, in terms of coming or going. So I'm not optimistic that's going to be resolved anytime soon. And I think obviously with an unemployment rate, I know you said people are looking for employees, but our unemployment rate is still 9 or 10%, right, depending on where you're at. The other thing that I've been pretty vocal on, you know, with the bill we originally passed and we extended unemployment benefits, but we did it at $600 a week. You know, that's been a holdup with the next stimulus package. I think the $600 a week, which of course is on top of another, you know, 300 or so you're going to get at the state level, you're disincentivizing people to go back to work. And so figuring out that appropriate amount is that from the federal level, I think it's probably in my district, it's probably around 200 or 300, but $600 a week, which a lot of my Democrat colleagues want, that may make sense in San Francisco or New York City, but doesn't make sense in Carthage or LaHood or Dallas City. So again, I think we got to be careful about doing these unemployment. We clearly need unemployment benefits, but at an appropriate amount. And on the immigration stuff, I mean, I'm not sure that's going to be cleared up until we have some clarity on solving the COVID problem by way of a vaccine or a treatment. That's just my hunch. And a lot of those decisions are made by this administration, right? And I think, again, I don't want to speak for the administration or the president, but they think with a high unemployment rate, we ought to be taking care of or having Americans look for work. But again, it gets into that problem, as you can't get people to go out and to get work, you're not getting the type of employee that you want or the type of worker. That's a frustration. Thank you.
Anyone of you have anything to add to that? So I did want to, Seamus, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot, and then Blanche, maybe we can end on a high note and kind of lead into the workforce development and the issue with employees. If you guys could maybe comment a little bit on the sort of progress we've made together in the past year, talking and working, especially you, Blanche, and how we've talked to Seamus and the apprenticeship programs and all that, and kind of go into that a little bit, and if you have any questions, lead into that. And Seamus, tell us what you do.
I don't think it's at all, but hey, Darin, how are you? Good to see you come back.
Dr. Riley, nice to see you.
Very good. So I'm President Carl Sandberg, and I had nice to see Representative Frese and Senator Tracy. I've written a letter to everybody in the, I think you probably got a letter from me as well. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the digital divide is one of the greatest barriers to education and K-12 and P20 level. But more crucially, it's central to the growth of our rural communities and to strengthening economic development. And so part of the sort of things we're trying to do is sort of look at ways in which we can leverage that digital advantage that we have at our campuses here. In a couple of months, we'll be going from 150 megabytes per second or minute or whatever it is to 1 gig, which is going to put us in a different stratosphere at our campuses. So our campuses can then become community centers for things that we can do. You know, bureaucracy is a great thing, and one of the difficulties in navigating any bureaucracy is, you know, you want to build to support everybody, but you can't give everybody what they want because there simply are not enough people. So part of what we've been working with Belinda and Blanche and I, looking at ways in which we can envision community workforce centers, where folks in our communities can come and get a ongoing education, because I think everybody knows now that we all need to be educated now all of the time. We're now Zoom experts. 7 months ago, none of us knew what Zoom was. Now we're relying on it to be our, you know, daily work piece. Ada was here a while ago and we talked about telemedicine. When I came down here 2 years ago and I said, what are we doing with telemedicine? Well, here in Carthage, you have an incredibly sophisticated hospital that has leveraged its resources to be able to bring those resources into our communities here in Hancock County and leverage that technology. For our young people, we need to be able to give them some ways in which they can cheaply pursue their education at a community college, get the first rung of the ladder, and keep going, because we know it works. Our community colleges are under populated at the moment, which is kind of amazing to me. Why? Because Midwest Tech, Peoria, who charged my air conditioning service technician $15,000 to get a HVAC certificate. Now that's good business if you're on the H in Midwest Tech. not great business for a young man who's now in debt for the next 15 years, 20 years of his life. So we have to leverage the resources that are supported by the state and by the federal government so that we can support our young people. Frankly, we have to educate everybody. It's not good enough to say that everybody should get a trade except my kid, because my kid's going to go get a bachelor's degree in political science because I know that'll be a good job at the end of it. And for some people it will, but for the majority it won't. And so developing that organic piece to support our students, what we do here in Hancock County with our dual credit program, with our dual enrollment program, it's not just helping those students, it's keeping our high schools open. And we're making sure that we're attacking the greatest challenges we have in our district. In my district, which is about 10 counties. 10% of the population of our district lack a high school diploma, and 20% of people over the age of 25 lack a bachelor's degree, or 27 people have only earned a bachelor's degree. 20% of the people in our district lack any post-secondary credential, which means in real terms they're unemployable. So we got to work together with our partners to make sure that we're attacking that. And I think the educational digital divide can become the economic digital connection for Hancock County and all the parts of Western Illinois. But to do that, we need the state and federal governments to build that internet highway. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and you hit on a number of great topics, and thanks for your service at Carl Sandburg and everything you're doing for the 10 counties that you represent. And our community colleges play such an important role on the education of our kids and our communities. It's vital, and we need to be there working in collaboration with you on that. And you heard what I said on the digital divide. I mean, I was amazed last March when all the high school kids went out of school, and the calls and the conversations we had with kids, and many of them in my district, that had no rural broadband or no connectivity. So they would go to a McDonald's parking lot, or go get on go to their friend's house and get on there, or go to the school parking lot. That it just highlighted, and then and you look at the percentage of kids that never logged on after March because they did not have good internet. And so this digital divide, this connectivity, which affects so many parts of our rural community, has to be there. And again, the story I gave earlier, I'm optimistic because we're seeing that in our urban areas now, and so there's collaboration with many of my colleagues from urban areas with our rural areas, but it has to be a focus because it affects education, it affects business, it affects our farmers to have rural broadband in the combines now with how sophisticated they are, and of course in healthcare. So I get it. And then on the education part of it, in educating our young people, I say it now, President Riley. I mean, we used to talk about blue collar and white collar jobs. Now we have new collar jobs. And so what that means is you can't fit into these categories you like to. New collar is maybe you have to learn how to be an engineer for BNSF Railroad, right? And so you're going to do that at Carl Sandburg, or you're going to become a technician, or you're going to learn something about putting up windmills. I mean, there's all these different things now, but you have to have that education. You have to have that learning and qualify for that. And Carl Sandburg plays such a big role in that moving forward. But that's the future, right? So investing on the state level and the federal level, and we have a wonderful community college system throughout Illinois. We really do. But we got to be there to help you and assist. Again, dollars and resources and working in collaboration. So thank you.
So just a couple comments on workforce. One thing I'll mention just to support the broadband has to do mostly with focusing on remote workers. And with this shift in work, we now see that what's coming is that many people will continue to work from home. So if we have the broadband investment in Hancock County, now we become an area where people can live and work anywhere in the world. So we really need to think about that future investment as how that's going to have an economic impact. And then I wanted to just address that we are working with LaHood. We've already been working with the employees that are there. We'll continue working with them. There are funds
We do have an apprenticeship program. Our area was awarded a grant to start apprenticeship programs, so we certainly will be looking towards companies to set that up. And we're working with our regional offices of education to find the dropouts, the kids that are not connected to school and not connected to work, because they're here and they're future workers. So just want to make it
Yeah, thank you, Blanche, for that. One other thing that I would just reference that's connected, I have an ag advisory committee. I mentioned earlier how, my district's one of the largest ag districts in the country. But our ag advisory committee, we meet on a quarterly basis. We have about 40 folks involved with agriculture. But one of the topics we talk about a lot is how do we bring young people back to rural America? How do we bring them back to communities where maybe they were born and raised and they went off to, University of Illinois or Western Illinois or ISU or our other institutions. And what happens when they go there? They got the best connectivity. They have the best internet, they have the best everything, and then they got to move back, and all of a sudden it's like night and day. And that affects a lot. And when you talk about being able to work anywhere, Blanche, that's key, right? Particularly with how we've almost, habits are changing in terms of the workforce. And that's where that connectivity and that broadband comes in so much. And so we constantly work on that, on upgrading that, because it's something that obviously is an enticement to get young people to come back to rural America.
Well, Illinois has invested a lot in tech broadband compared to where we were, but it's still not enough. So we just want to keep that focus moving forward.
Yeah, thanks. I'll let Randy or Jill, if you guys want to comment at all.
Just on the subject of education, I spent, and also on Zoom. I was an hour and a half Zoom conference this morning on teen reach programs and early childhood after school type programs. Very important. We have some very, very key business allies with that in Adams County. We're looking at something to expand and coordinate in Warren County. They really need it there. They are very, more, I'd say, more diverse in the ethnicity and racial in Warren County, so they really need it, and I think that's very important. And I always like to tell the story also that my mom completed 8th grade, my father completed 7th grade. This was right after the stock market crash, and then coming into the Depression, they had to get out, and they had to go to work, is what they said. But my mother knew, my mother and father both knew, that wasn't going to be the way of the future. Education was a priority in our home, and we need to make education a priority in every family's home. And expanding broadband is wonderful for all the things you mentioned, for keeping people here that work here, they can work from home, and educating in this very, very fast-paced technological world. We need to keep our young people up to speed, and it's so very, very crucial, so very, very important. So just comments. Anything, Jill?
So I just wanted to close out today and say thank you to each and every one of you for attending, and I believe that your thoughts were inspiring, and I know they were to me, and I'm sure they were to our legislators as well. I want to thank each of you for joining us today, and I really feel like you got something about the flavor of Hancock throughout this period that maybe you hadn't realized how, much people are not only suffering here, but we're not taking it lying down. We're fighting back, and we're not giving up. We're trying to figure out ways that we can get through this, and we're being strong, together. But we just ask you to keep on partnering with us. I will also just add in that what HCED is done is we have a strategic plan. The 3 areas that we have on that strategic plan are workforce development, marketing and business expansion and retention. Obviously, the marketing, the business retention and expansion are huge, but probably the most the needed area, as Doug pointed out, is our workforce development. A key action step that we have added to our strategic plan just in the last year is not only high schoolers and the young workers, but also adult and reentry workers, because, hey, I'm going to be 54, 55, I don't even remember, in a few weeks, but I'll be receiving my master's in economic and community development in a couple months 10 years ago, I was playing Farmville at home on a computer, and I was married and couldn't have told you what economic development was. So that's what education does for you. Education in real life, common sense, on the ground, boots on the ground. I'm working it, and I'm learning every day. And now I can sit down and have a conversation on economic development with people that have been in the field for 30 years, and with our legislators. The next thing that I will add to you is that many of you know I'm now working remotely due to my personal circumstances and my family that's ill from Champaign in Urbana. So what that means to all of us is my final internship for my classes at WIU. I'm being allowed to serve with Representative Mike Marin, and I'm working some with Scott Bennett as well, Senator Scott Bennett. So we have legislators, not only these three, that know what we're happening and what's going on here in Hancock County in rural Illinois, because truly that is what we represent. We represent the rest of Illinois that is rural and is going through the same things that we are going through. Now we have legislators across the state that are hearing about Hancock County and know exactly what we're experiencing. So don't think for one moment anymore that we can call Hancock County Forgotonia, because truthfully, it's not just these, our congressmen and our two legislators that are hearing about Hancock County. It's also, the people that I work with in Champaign County and Vermilion County, the folks that I work with in Douglas County. We have people that are listening to us. And if anybody has anything that they need me to bring to anybody's attention as far as, Springfield or wherever I have to take it, whatever agency, it's director@growhancock.com. That's my phone number. And I might not be physically on the ground here, but I think my mayors will tell you, or Amy, or anybody on my executive committee, if you call me or you email me, you're going to reach me. If you don't reach me right then, I'm going to call you back, or I'm going to email you back. I'm with Hancock County, and we're going to make it through this, and we're going to be stronger and better than ever. And I'm appreciative of each and every one of you for what you're doing, and I'm super appreciative to all of you, and I just want you to know, let's keep on doing it, all right? And thank you, guys.